Today, duck and colour. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to our latest post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. So the Reserve Bank released their May statement on monetary policy, and it shows a substantial reduction in growth and inflation forecasts. The GDP growth is now forecast at 2.6% for 2019 and 2.7% for 2020. And that compares with 3% and 2.7% in the February statement. Now, the main explanations for the growth reductions for 2019 are consumption, which was down to 2% from 2.5% previously, and dwelling investment, down 6.7% from the previous 4.5%. And of course, the underlying inflation forecast, the trimmed mean, have been reduced from 2% for 2019 in the February statement of monetary policy to 1.75% in May, and the 2020 forecast reduced from 2.25% to 2%. And it's also worth noting that the forecast for the unemployment rate has been slightly increased, with the 5% unemployment rate still expected to hold through 2019, but the fall to 4.75% has been pushed back from 2020 to June 2021. Now, it's important to understand that these forecasts are all based on market pricing for the profile of the RBA cash rate and the current Aussie dollar. And in February, markets had one cut priced in for February 2020, whereas now one full cut is priced in for August, and a second is priced in for May 2020. And the trade weighted index is 2% lower than in February. So, despite a significantly lower cash rate profile, the growth and inflation forecasts have been lowered. And these current forecasts are significantly below trend at 2.75%, and inflation only holding right at the bottom of the 2 to 3% target band out to the end of their forecasting period. So I think reading into this, it seems that the RBA now believes that it will need to cut rates just to achieve an acceptable outcome. Now, of course, the question that arises is whether these cuts should be immediate. And I guess the answer to that is not necessarily if, like the RBA, you think that the tension between the labour market and economic growth, as shown in the national accounts, suggests that there may still be some upside from growth in the labour market and growth in incomes. In the introduction to the Statement of Monetary Policy, the RBA said, in contrast to the signal coming from the national accounts, a number of labour market indicators remain positive. Employment growth was strong in the March quarter, the vacancy rate remains high, and there are ongoing reports of skill shortages. However, the RBA's own forecasts don't seem to envisage an unemployment rate falling further until 2021, even with the rate cuts now embedded in their forecast. Consequently, we wonder whether their labour market forecasts might actually be a little bit off. And if so, the favourable dynamic that may be there with regard to a strong labour market may actually dissipate. And I think it's worth just highlighting that, of course, the unemployment numbers, which are driven from the ABS data, are notoriously inaccurate and do move around a little bit. So if, in fact, the Reserve Bank is now targeting more on employment rather than inflation, then that actually is quite a big deal and it might be fraught with more risks. Indeed, the final sentence in the May Statement of Monetary Policy says that the board will be paying close attention to developments in the labour markets at its upcoming meetings. Now, my own view is, I'm afraid, that the unemployment rate is likely to move higher over the next few months. Not only are we seeing job losses in construction, in the finance sector, and in some retail areas, but we're also seeing more concern from our SME surveys about future job prospects. And those people in the construction sector are telling me that their forward pipeline of work is continuing to wilt. So my expectation is that we'll start to see the unemployment rate rising later in the year, and it could even be as high as 5.5% as we go through Christmas and into the new year in 2020. If that is the case, then I'm afraid that the forward indicators for the economy are actually a little more dire and certainly worse than the Reserve Bank is currently banking on. Something else very interesting in the Statement of Monetary Policy. They focus specifically on the components of the Consumer Price Index, the CPI basket, that are associated with housing. And there are two. They are rents and new dwelling purchases by owner-occupiers, which together account for around 1/6 of the CPI basket. Now, there are a number of other housing-related components in the CPI, including utilities, dwelling repairs and maintenance, and property rates and charges. And demand for housing may also exert an indirect influence on inflation, for example, by influencing prices for furniture and white goods. And price inflation in these two components is influenced by conditions in local housing and construction markets and can vary considerably by city. Inflation in rents and new dwellings have each averaged a little over 3% in year-ended terms since 2002. But over the past year, these two components have been weaker than average and have contributed noticeably less to CPI inflation. Rent inflation was 0.4% and new dwelling cost inflation was 1.2%. The new dwelling purchase component of the CPI captures the cost of adding to the housing stock newly built dwellings and major renovations. And it's measured as the price of a new dwelling excluding the value of the land. Now, the land is excluded because land is treated as an investment asset rather than a consumable item. And the cost of servicing a mortgage has also been excluded from the CPI since 1998, although it is included in the ABS's selected living cost indices. In analysis of the CPI before 1998, the RBA generally excludes the impact of mortgage interest charges. And purchases of established dwellings are not captured in the CPI because they are treated as transfers of existing assets. So as a result, the price of established dwellings has no direct influence on CPI inflation. For most dwelling types, the Australian Bureau of Statistics obtains prices by surveying home builders. The types of new dwellings captured by the survey are those most commonly built in each capital city. And the ABS adjusts the final prices of new dwellings to take into account first home owner grants and purchase incentives, both of which reduce the effective price faced by the consumer. Initially, only newly built detached houses were captured in the CPI. However, newly built apartments and other attached dwellings, such as townhouses, have been included since 2017. Although the ABS does not publish CPI figures separately for houses and apartments, the closely related Producer Price Index, the PPI, output of construction series, provides an approximation of price movements for new houses and apartments. Prices for new houses and apartments do not necessarily move in tandem. One reason for this is that the materials used in construction differ substantially between houses and apartments. Timber and bricks are generally the major materials used in house construction. In contrast, steel and concrete are typically the biggest material inputs to apartment construction. And over much of the past decade, prices for new apartments have risen more slowly than prices for new houses. However, this trend has reversed over the past year. Inflation in the price of new houses has declined because home builders have increased the size of purchase incentives to encourage sales. And over the same period, new apartment price inflation has increased, driven by higher input costs, particularly for steel products. Ongoing strength in other types of construction has contributed to the pickup in new apartment price inflation because the materials and trades used in apartment construction are similar to those used in non-residential building and infrastructure construction. And the rent component of the CPI captures payments made by households to landlords as rent. For privately owned properties, the ABS tracks the rents paid on a sample of rental dwellings in each city over time. Rents for publicly owned housing are estimated by the ABS using information collected from government housing authorities. Advertised rents are a leading indicator of CPI rents. However, new rents account for only a proportion of the existing rental stock and so pass through to the CPI rents measure gradually. But I have to say that the analysis that I've done of the true housing costs seem to me to be significantly higher than those within the CPI series. So I'm afraid that this approach to measuring CPI and associating it with houses as I've described doesn't seem to me to be working that well, and is one reason why the CPI is reported much lower than it really is. Anyway, in conclusion, the statement of monetary policy today emphasises that the RBA thinks it's highly likely that it will need to follow market pricing with 2 rate cuts. Now, the timing of that is a little bit uncertain. Could be July, could be August, and the second, well, later in the year, or perhaps November, or even into next year. It seems to me that it is quite likely that we will see the first rate rise sooner rather than later, and the second rise probably this year, not next. However, my own view is that this will not be sufficient to turn the economy around, nor indeed turn home prices around. So I've still got a pretty strong feeling that we're going to end up with lower interest rates than perhaps many think, and the Reserve Bank will also start quantitative easing, and that will probably mean purchasing asset-backed securities initially to pump more into the economy. I'm afraid that the journey from this point forward is going to mirror horribly the US in 2007, 8 and 9, where asset prices were blown sky high, including, of course, the stock market, which is why the stock market is pretty strong just now. But ultimately, that translates to higher debt and more difficulty later. The RBA path from here looks to me to be fraught with difficulty, and unfortunately, savers will be taken to the cleaners, debts will continue to rise, and we may look back on this particular season as the turning point in the RBA's strategy. As I say, it's time to duck and cover. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.